in the camera.
Tilt it down a little bit. Okay. I can't see anything on the screen.
Well, we got the person turned off and we're just sharing the computer.
Okay. Okay. I just want, before I introduce David, which seems a little silly because it seems like everybody knows him. Everybody's here for him. So I just want to say a couple of really quick things. So just to follow up what Dennis said about the tour of downtown Las Cruces, Chris Schertz has actually volunteered to lead us on that tour. And if you're not familiar with his work, he's the person that was responsible for doing all of the historic markers downtown. So it will be a tour that kind of piggybacks on some of the historic buildings in downtown Las Cruces. We're going to try to do it in the evening where it's a little bit cooler, and I think we're shooting for a Thursday night. But October is a really busy month as far as conferences go, so we're trying to nail down one. So that's why I think it'll be in early November, but we'll give you an update on that. Second thing too, not too late to have a conversation about the Historical Society of New Mexico. This year, the conference is going to be in Roswell. So always really great panels, always some really great discussions. So if you have an opportunity and a chance to partake in that in late April, it'd be great and be very welcome. It'd also be really great if you have any Southern New Mexico history, so we could actually have Southern New Mexico history represented at the conference too. So, okay. With that being said, tonight we have David G. Thomas, who holds a bachelor and a master's degree. He's also the author of 14 books on New Mexico history. He's also a filmmaker, producer, playwright, screenwriter, the co-founder of the Pat Garrett Western Heritage Festival, and the co-founder of the Friends of Pat Garrett. In addition, he's the winner of the 2020 Will Rogers Medallion Award for Western Biography and the 2022 Will Rogers Medallion Award for Western Maverick. I hope I got that right. You can correct me if I did not. And tonight he's here to talk about Giovanni Maria de Agostina, the Hermit of La Cueva, New Mexico, La Cueva, New Discoveries, which was also a documentary made in 2019 called The Wonder of the Century, based on this book. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to David Thomas.
That shows the screen is the big thing, but people like to see your face. Okay, so try to stay just directly behind them. Okay.
Thank you, Jerry. This would probably be someone's phone. I am so pleased to talk about my favorite person, Giovanni Maria de Agostini. Is anyone not heard of the Hermit of La Cueva? Good, I'm not surprised. Hermit's Peak is named after him, of course. I want to talk, I'm going to go as quickly as I can through this. I want to talk about some of the stuff I've learned since I wrote my book, which came out about 8 years ago. And most of it came out as a result of the film that we made. This is the book. This is the film. I co-produced it with a Brazilian company, and we shot in 5 countries. We shot in 8 locations in Brazil. We shot in Motupi in Peru, in Mexico, and at Pico de Orizaba, which is the 3rd largest mountain in our hemisphere. And the Hermit had a cave there. We shot in New Mexico in 5 locations. And then we shot in the Hermit's hometown in Sozzano, Italy. So one of the things that we learned is when I wrote my book, I knew the year that Giovanni had been born, but I did not know the date. And since we found these birth records in the church in his hometown in Italy, we now know exactly when he was born, which was July 11th. We know the name of his father, which you can see there. We know the name of his mother. We know that he had 2 older brothers who died before he was born. He had a younger sister that lived into her 50s. And the oral stories about the Hermit were always that he came from a wealthy, noble family. Well, he didn't. He came from a very poor, itinerant farm working family that moved around and worked in the fields. However, the house in which he's born is still standing. And this is it. This is the ruin of the house in which he was born. And of course, there was just many, many itinerant farmers living there. So he's one of many people that were born there. But I'm not going to go into the sort of details that I write about in the book, but After he traveled in Europe, he went to South America. And he wrote his memoirs, which I quote in my book. And the only thing he said about his childhood, and I'll quote it here real quick, is at the age of 5 years, more or less, I began to incline toward a solitary life. So then at 17, he left and he wandered around Europe. And he spent 20 years, he stayed in monasteries, he visited pilgrimage sites, he studied in schools, he studied with people, he became a pretty educated person. But in 1838, he decided that he was going to go to the New World. And so he wanted to be able to go as a religious person, but he did not want to be part of the Catholic Church. So he joined an abbey in Italy known as the Abbey St. Anthony, and it was a Maronite Christian monastery. Now, Maronite Christianity is a rare sect. Most of the Maronites are in Syria and Lebanon, although they're a little bit scattered around the world now. There were none in South America at the time he left for South America. And only about 60 years before this monastery was opened in Rome, the Maronite Church recognized the authority of the Pope. Before that, they did not. So once they did that, the Pope allowed them to open a monastery in Rome, and this is the one he joined. And the Maronite Christians were founded by Saint Maron, who was in Syria at about 350 AD. This is a picture of the monastery in Rome. We visited the monastery. I visited a couple of times. The last time I was up there, there was a new father in charge, and he refused to let us in, unfortunately. But anyway, the previous times we did get to go in. This is a map out of my book. It shows each of these circles is a place in which I document that he traveled to in my book and talk about what he did there and so on. He circumnavigated the continent twice. He went down the Amazon by canoe. He got malaria. He talks about in the Amazon, the ticks were so thick that they just covered your feet with blackness. He almost always walked. However, in my research, I did find a few times where he took a boat from one place to another. But imagine doing all this distance, like of course he did in Europe, on foot. There are two pictures of him, two legitimate pictures of him. The first one was taken in Chile in 1859. The second one was taken in Cuba, in Havana, in 1861. I go into it in my book. I'm not going to talk about it particularly, but once he came to Mexico from South America, he got over 100,000 followers. The government was afraid that he was a political figure, which he was not. They arrested him. They tried to charge him with cheating people. They couldn't make that stick. Finally, they decided he was mentally insane. However, the doctors that he hired proved that he wasn't. So he was deported. And he was deported to Havana, Cuba, and he was deported by a group of soldiers from Veracruz. And when he arrived in Cuba, they took this picture and the paper published it. They made postcards out of it, and they dubbed him the Wonder of the Century. So that's how he got his title, the Wonder of the Century. Here is his encounter with the Inquisition. And this was a profound experience in his life. In 1859, he was arrested in Chile. And surprisingly enough, the Inquisition was still fairly strong in Chile. And that was about the only place in South America. And he was accused of being a priest impostor because he dressed as a monk. After all, he was a member of a monastery. Nevertheless, since they'd never heard of Maronite Christians, they didn't know particularly what it was. They was afraid that he was pretending to be a priest. So he was ordered to no longer wear that dress, the habit. And so he made his own uniform. And what he says about this experience, he says, up to this time, I had worn the habit of the monastic life, but finally I had to part with it on account of some persons, may God forgive them, but having dropped the habit, I was not ready to part with the solitary life, which had always been my vocation. So he devised his own uniform, okay? And his uniform consisted of a blue robe with a red tau cross. Now, the tau is the Greek letter T, and it stands for word. And that was actually the first Christian symbol, even before the cross. And so he always wore that on his uniform, and this is what, and the newspaper describes his dress and the colors. And this is a colorized version of that picture that was taken in Havana, Cuba. And you can see the red towel on his shoulder. You can see the blue cape and so on. Now, one of the interesting things is there are many oral stories about him in New Mexico, because he lived in Las Vegas, New Mexico, Hermit's Peak, and so on. No one ever mentioned that he was crippled, but he was. His hand was crippled. And in an 1844 passport, which I found in Brazil, it says one of his distinguishing features is he's crippled in 3 fingers on the left hand. And you can see it a little bit in his photographs, although the photographs are not very plain. Now, what's interesting about the hermit is last February, Carla, are you here? Carla? I think Carla interviewed the hermit.
I don't know if it was supernatural. I don't know if it was a product of my incredibly deep curiosity and vivid imagination. But yes, he was there in the flesh. He was a little dusty, a little crusty, a little confused, but he was most certainly wearing that outfit. And I think the most astonishing thing, David, is he looks so similar to you. It was very unnerving and discombobulating for me as well.
Well, wasn't he in the Rio Grande Theater on the stage?
But he was quite surprised to wake up and only see us. And so I did have to kind of orient him a little bit. He was confused by the cell phone, but almost a little bit hesitant to try to But a very interesting man. I had not harmed his memory.
Very sharp.
It was pretty amazing.
Okay, so I'd like to talk about a little bit about his cultural legacy. Of course, we know Hermit's Peak in Las Vegas, but there's 4 big festivals in South America, 1 in Argentina, 2 in Brazil, and 1 in Peru. And we went to the Peru one and we shot it, and I'm going to show you some stuff about it. It was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. There's also a national park in Brazil named after him. There's pilgrimage places, and there is a statue in one of the towns. So in Peru, in Motupe, he was there in 1841. And wherever the hermit went, he left behind a cross. And this cross was found then in 1868, that he'd left there about over 20 years earlier. And they started this festival in his name. The name of the mountain, the cave that he was staying in, was Chalpón. And this became known as the Festival La Cruz del Chalpón. And it was started in 1868. And we filmed there in 2018, which was the 150th year of the festival. And the festival lasts a week. And on the last day of the festival, they take the cross down from his cave and they walk it to the nearest town, which is Motupe. And it's about a 7-mile walk. And people follow it. This is, the dot shows you there in northern Peru, where Motupe is. Okay, it's pretty far north. This is a close-up. If you look, you can see Motupe is marked there on about the center and the right. And it's an area very similar to here. There's mountains, and then there's this huge desert area, and there's nothing there. There's no water, there's no people living there, there's nothing. And he lived right there on the edge of the mountain, which is the sort of place that he liked to live. He always lived in a cave wherever he went. If you see the X in the upper left corner, you can see the valley. You can see Motupe down at the bottom, and you can see the X at the top of that little valley. This is a close-up of the valley. The cave of the cross of Chalpón is up there. This development down below a little bit, that only comes alive during the festival. And that was been built up over the years, over the 150 years. And during that week, in which you have over 100,000 people show up, there's vendors there, there's all kinds of things there. The rest of the year, that is not particularly occupied. This is a picture from the festival in 1907. and that's at the base of the climb to his cave. This is also from 1907 when people are following the cross to Motupi, to the church in Motupi. This is in the church, and you can see the cross is always dressed. And this is actually a Catholic tradition. And this is 1907. It's in the cathedral in Motupe. And you can see it there, kind of on the right. And here's another picture of it, and you can see the people actually praying to it. Now, in his memoirs, he said, I'm going to paraphrase him, but he says, I have no miraculous powers. Okay. I did know about herbs and various things that could heal people. He did believe that certain springs had some healative and maybe somewhat miraculous powers, but he never claimed to have miraculous powers. But all over South America now, he's never been canonized as a saint, but all over South America, he's considered the equivalent of a saint, and people pray to him for their health. They pray for their children. And when we filmed, I'm not going to go into it. When we filmed a lot of this particular thing. We filmed a lot of people talking about what the hermit meant to them and how praying to him had healed them and changed their life and so on. But he himself he was a very educated man. He always carried about 20 books with him. He never claimed to have any miraculous powers. And also many times the church tried to get him in various places to join the church, and he refused because he was trying to go back to an original Christianity that was pre-Catholic church. And his model was Saint Anthony, who started the very first monastery, which is in Egypt. And I've got all the details about it in my book and so on. And this was before the Catholic Church was really organized, before it was really part of the government, that sort of stuff. And he was trying to start these religious communities that went back to that pre-church Christianity and that were independent of the church. So it's interesting, the church has embraced him, particularly in Brazil, but he did not embrace the church. This is an undated image, early image. You can see the cross there in the center. It's dressed, and various images around it. This is from a book published in 1959. This is a picture of the cross, also dressed and decorated, from the 1960s. This is after the cross has been brought down from the cave into the church in Motupe. Okay, so this amazing walkway was built in 1957. And it fell down in 2017, the year before we went there. And I just could not believe it. When I saw pictures of this amazing structure, and it was just such a disappointment that it was no longer there. So this is the top part. This is another shot, and this was taken in 2017. And you can see the rainwater coming down. And they had an extraordinary rain, and it washed it out, unfortunately. There's another picture of it. You can see it's incredibly elaborate. Okay, there's a picture of people carrying the cross, walking down it from the cave, bringing the cross back to take to town. There's a close-up of people on the walkway taking the cross. Isn't that an amazing picture? This is what it looks like today. It's all washed out, except for a little bit at the top and a little bit at the bottom. Now, this has been built at the base. And this was built a few years before the walkway washed out. And that's where the cross now starts from. So a select group of people, it's kind of a brotherhood of sorts, and you have to be invited to it, take care of the cross during the year. And then they bring it down to this facility, which, if you remember that valley, there was a little bit of construction down at the bottom. This is in that area. And this is where they begin then the march or the walk to go to town. And this is where people then gathered if they want to walk with the cross on that particular day, which we did. And this is in that facility. This is what the cross looked like that year. You can see it's dressed. The wood cross is actually kept encased in a metal case to protect it. And you can see there that it's inside a metal sleeve. This is a close-up of it. as people, and so they're just on the verge of leaving the facility to walk it to town, and you see already people want to touch it. And and this happened on the entire walk for 7 miles. People they would touch it, they would raise their babies to it. That, you know, it was an amazing, amazing thing to see. This is just leaving the facility. Oops. You can see besides being in a metal case, it's also enclosed in something so they can carry it. This is steel, basically, about halfway to Motupe. Here's another video. The people in the blue shirts are the Brotherhood. It says 150. It's the 150th anniversary. They take care of it. There's a replica in front. This is a steel, basically taken about the same time. Another video. Now they allow people to trade off. So people who want to can carry it part of the way. And you can see they've paused here to allow people to carry it. Now, at the time, I was kind of struck by the fact that here we have this religious ceremony, this deeply mystical, a spiritual experience that people come from all over Peru and from various places in South America to experience. And people are wearing T-shirts. I mean, that's kind of the modern element. They wouldn't have been wearing T-shirts, you know, in 1907, of course. We'll play that again. Okay. Now, when they get close to the church, and they built a new church for the cross in Motupe, it's no longer the cathedral, they bring an icon of Mary out to meet it. And so about, you know, 3/4 of a mile or maybe a quarter mile from the church, they bring the icon out of the church to meet the cross. And you can see the cross there in front, and you can see the icon of Mary in the background. And here's a video of it. And they rock the cross. When the cross meets Mary, they rock the cross. And now she's turning and they're going to go to the church. And this is a picture of it as they approach the church. Or let's see, this is the video. Coming toward the church is behind us. And some people did part of the way on their knees. And notice he's wearing a blue robe like the hermit did. Here comes the cross. You can see the church on the right. Okay, so here's a picture of basically the same time. The church is called the Temple of the Cruz of Chalpon, and it's fairly new. This is a picture of it taken that morning before the cross arrived. Beautiful. This is the inside of it. This is the altar. You can see there's a replica of the Hermit's cross there that's dressed. Of course, you can buy souvenirs. I wish I'd bought one, to be quite honest, but I didn't. But anyway, they're replicas of the cross with the Hermit's dress. Now, the cathedral in Lima has an entire corner devoted to Agostini. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a little bit of irony involved there, considering the fact that he refused to become a member of the church a number of times, certainly refused to become a priest. But nevertheless, this is a beautiful painting. I don't know whether it's a gold frame or not, but it's at least painted gold. See the tau cross on his robe? His robe's not particularly purple, which they probably didn't know the color of it at the time. But anyway, that's a picture of him. You notice he's got a halo around his head, basically like he was a saint, essentially. Down to bottom left corner, there's a cross you can see. Don't know whether you can see it very well or not. And then this is the entire corner of the church that's devoted to him. And you can see there's a replica of the cross there, and a number of things in the background. The cross there is in the center. You can see it pretty good there on the screen. A picture of heaven up above. Visiting that church, which was built in the late 1850s, was really something. There's an ossuary in the basement, and there's about 10,000 people buried there. And the bones are all sorted based on type. So there's rooms with just skulls. There's rooms with just leg bones, rooms with just feet, rooms with just hands, rooms with just the center part of the skeleton, all stacked up in patterns, just thousands of them in these rooms. I didn't put in a picture, but it's, of course, they had something similar in Italy, but it's an amazing thing to see. Okay, I would like to end a little bit with the details about his death. Of course, I go into lots of stuff that we don't talk about in the book, but anyway, this is the practice that he followed in South America. He followed it in Las Vegas. He would be in a cave, you know, up in the mountain somewhere. He would build a fire so that the closest settlement could see it every Friday, and they would know that he was okay. So when he was up at La Cueva in the Organ Mountains, on April 30th, 1869, there was no fire. And it was observed that there was no fire. So the next day, which was a Saturday, Colonel Fountain's father-in-law, Antonio Garcia, went up to check and see what was wrong. And he wrote a first-person account of what he found, and I've got this in my book. And this is what he says. I found the hermit's books, his bedding and clothing, but the hermit was gone. I then was convinced that the good hermit had been killed. I searched for the body for a while, but failed to find it. On my way coming back, that would have been to Mesilla, I met 2 sheep herders. I promised to give them $5 if they found the body. The next day, one of the sheep herders came into Mesilla and told him he had found the body. And this is what Garcia says about it. He says, "It seems that the murderers attacked the hermit while he was in bed in the cave in La Cueva, as he only had his underwear clothes on. It appears that he was taken from the cave to the place where the body was found." This last is a quote also. "It seems that the hermit kneeled down before he was killed. He had a heavy blow on the back of his head. The body was face down, had a crucifix in his hand. Both of his lungs were pierced with a knife or a lance." Now, there were 4 or 5 different theories about who killed him and so on. I go into them into my book. What Garcia believed, and most people at the time believed, was that he was killed by a Native American war party. They came over from the Sacramento Mountains, and they had attacked Tularosa and taken some cattle and some horses. And then they got in a fight when they crossed the San Agustin Pass. And in that fight, 1 soldier and 1 non-soldier were killed. The Native Americans that lived in the Organ Mountains, they knew him well. They would never have harmed him. This was a group that came over from the Sacramento Mountains. That's the most likely theory about what happened to him. It's supported by the description of his death. And then I would like to talk about his Cecilio in Spanish, or his Cecis, or in Italian it would be Chilici. And again, this is Garcia talking. When the underwear was removed, it was discovered that he was wearing an iron belt with small spikes welded around his waist, which must have been placed there when the saintly man was quite young, as it was so adhered to the waist that they had to leave it on as it was when they buried him. He had another Sicilian hanging to his breast and his back, which would have been like a hair shirt. And this is a monastic practice that goes back to the beginning of Christianity. And it's based on this philosophy or this practice of intentional suffering. And that's a very strange word, because we live our lives, we suffer, we all suffer, we try to avoid suffering. Why would you intentionally inflict suffering on yourself, suffering that you don't have to experience? And there's a number of reasons for that, but the main reason for this practice is that people doing it, it allows them to really empathize with people that have suffering in the world. And it reminds them of this. So that's the primary basis for that practice, which in the modern world seems very strange, but it's a common practice in almost all religious traditions. The iron belt with the inwardly pointing spikes, which had been placed in place for so long that Agostini's skin had partially grown over it, had been done before he left Europe, probably. So they had the funeral in the Barella house on the Mesilla Plaza. I found the church records, so I know the precise date that they think he died. Of course, he was already dead, so they didn't have to have last rites or anything. And then, of course, he's buried in the Mesilla Cemetery. And the original stone was crafted by Colonel Fountain, and it's the base of this. And it became unreadable in 1949. And so this cement stone was put up in its place. And of course, everything on the stone is wrong. The name is wrong and so on. But nevertheless, that's where he's buried. So that is the end. And I would love to answer any questions if there are any. Yes, sir.
Did you get to touch the cross?
Did what?
Were you able to touch the cross?
I was able to touch the cross in the case and so on, but I was also filming it, so I didn't carry it. But some of our party did. They participated. But people were so moved. It was an incredible experience. It really was an incredible thing. And I've never experienced anything like it in my life. Any other questions? Yes?
Well, since he was a Marianite, he was obviously probably pretty aware of, Coptic or Antioch
Yeah, he was closer to the Coptics than the Catholics.
America was dominated by Roman Catholics.
Yeah, yeah, because the Pope had allowed the Maronites into the Catholic family, you might say. They, educated people should have known. But there was a couple of complaints lodged against him in Chile. I don't know about who by, might have been some priests or something. So then he was brought into court and grilled, and he was concerned, that there would be a penalty.
Well, since he was always looking for the original Catholicism, which Orthodoxy is, did you ever come across any thoughts of his or writings of his?
Well, yeah, I have it. He has a short memoir which I found in Italy, and it's in my book. So in my book, which I have a few down here, I quote it, and that's one way I was able to determine all the places he went to. Now, when he showed up in Las Vegas, New Mexico, he had these, according to numerous reports, he had these incredible documents. He had passports, he had visas, he had all this sort of stuff with him. It was, people that saw it said it was amazing. And when he died, it went into various hands, eventually ended up in Santa Fe. And then in the 60s, it was taken to Italy. And I was able to track it to as far as that. And then it disappears. And the person I know that had it died. He was an archaeologist. He died. His collection is in a museum in southern Italy, but I contacted them. There's no sign of the Herman's amazing documents there in his collection. All he's got there is his archaeological collection. So we don't know what happened to it. Unfortunately.
My question was, since he's not for simpler or original Catholicism with Orthodoxy, I wondered if he ever have any evidence that he refused to join the Roman Catholic Church?
Yes.
Kind of piece of the schism.
Well, see, he modeled himself after Saint Anthony the Abbot. But he does say in his memoirs at least twice that he was asked to become a priest and he didn't want to be. He didn't want to become part of the church. So he does write that specifically in his memoirs. But I contacted the monastery, the original monastery that St. Anthony started still exists in Egypt. And I contacted them and I write about it in my book. And it's the very first monastery. And St. Anthony, at about 17, left home and became a wandering hermit sort of person. He lived in a cemetery, in a grave in a cemetery for about 20 years. Then for about 20 years, he was sealed up in a building, and to feed him, they had to drop food down from the top. And eventually he goes to this cave that's near the Red Sea on the Egyptian side, and people gather around him. And that's the beginning of the monastery. And it was the same with St. Marin. St. Marin was a hermit that lived on the top of a mountain, and he's known as the first hermit that didn't live in any shelter. He just lived exposed to the elements. And people gathered around him, and that began the basis of the Maronite monastery, which is the basis of the church. And what's different about a Maronite monastery, and the reason that he wanted to join it, one reason is the monks don't have to stay in the monastery like they do really in any monastery. Now, you could be a friar, but a monk is basically, unless he has a job out somewhere or something, has to stay in the monastery. Whereas Maronite, in a Maronite monastery, you can come and go as you want, but you're still a monk.
It seems like you found a lot of information in South America, but what about his time during New England?
Well, in the book, I've traced where he went to a certain extent, and he writes about it some in his memoirs. But other than in his church, in his hometown, where in the film we show the finding of the birth record and that sort of stuff. Other than that, he seems to be kind of forgotten in Europe. Now, like I say, his festival in Argentina is well known in Argentina, particularly in Brazil. In Peru, he's known in Peru, and I've got various reports that there might be a picture of him in a museum, but I haven't been able to track that down. But yeah, there's not that much known about his travels in Europe, but we do know that he was quite well educated. He could read Latin, and had studied in some of the monasteries that he was in and so on. And we know from his memoirs that he considered becoming a monk in one of the monasteries in Europe and decided not to. Was there another one? Yes.
I know we talked about this, but why isn't there a bigger monument for him?
When I first finished the book, or first came here, I saw this really rough picture of him. I thought, that is the most amazing guy. I've got to learn something about him. So I spent years doing the research, had to hire a Portuguese translator, a Latin translator, an Italian translator, and a Spanish translator to translate the documents. I found, through a very complicated process, I found newspaper articles about him from Brazil from the 1840s. I found newspaper articles in Mexico from the 1860s, a few from this country, some from Italy. And eventually I found all this information. Well, the original plaque, which was based on the oral stories that were around here, which were virtually all wrong. The original plaque in the cave of La Cueva was completely wrong. They didn't even have his name right. But it's been replaced now with one that's a little bit more accurate. But that is basically the only monument, is that plaque in the cave.
This guy's.
Well, people do visit his grave in the Mesilla Cemetery, of course. But yeah, you know, it's hard to know whether, you know, we should do that or not. It's hard to know. You know, he's different than a historical figure like, say, Billy the Kid. I've written about Billy the Kid. It's very important, I think, that Billy the Kid have a grave. For Agostini, it's a kind of a little bit different. He's in a little bit different category. Yes.
I just wanted to follow up with the question about the grave, and we see it. So are there a lot of pilgrimage to the grave?
There are.
And so, like, is it ceremonial in any way?
Well, when we filmed here, like I say, I worked with a Brazilian production company. And so the crew and everything was Brazilian. And I had corresponded with this author from Brazil who had written his dissertation on the Hermit. And I got a lot of information from his dissertation and from him. He was so moved when he got to visit the grave. I mean, it was something to see. But see, in South America, they thought he'd been killed at a certain date at a certain place. So even though there were books written about him, even in the late 1800s, they all, because this cave they was living in, he disappeared and they found blood. Okay. So they all concluded that he'd been killed at that point. Okay. Well, this Brazilian author that I met, he was the one that figured out from Brazil that the hermit in New Mexico was the same guy. And I learned that from him. So I was researching everything I could about him in New Mexico, which wasn't that much. And once this guy got in touch with me, and that opened that entire world. And I realized all this incredible stuff. Now, we knew in this country they had been in South America, and we knew they had been in Mexico, because there's newspaper articles about this time in which he was arrested in Mexico in our press, but that's basically all we knew. So that opened up all that possible research. At a certain point, I hired a researcher to go into National Archives and get certain documents for me. And so it was a very elaborate process, and it's that I put in the book. Thank you.
David,
Yes?
you had another question right here. I don't think you saw.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Why did it not crash when it comes to?
You know, I don't know, but it's an old tradition. Whether it's done in other ceremonies, I don't know. Maybe it's just a greeting. Until I saw it, you know, I didn't know they did it. But yeah, that was part of the ceremony of meeting the icon of merit. And when we started out on that walk from the base of the cave there, from those see, I couldn't climb to the cave, unfortunately, but everybody in the film crew did. But we started there, we didn't know what was going to happen. We had no idea really what was going to happen, going along with the crowd and filming it. Thank you.
Thank you, David.